You know, there's something profoundly different about this moment in European history. For decades after the Cold War, we got comfortable. We believed that liberal democracy had won, that the arc of history bent inevitably towards freedom, that the major powers would settle into peaceful competition within a rules based international order. We were wrong. And now, as European leaders quietly discuss scenarios that once seemed unthinkable, French and German troops potentially operating in Ukraine, we're witnessing Europe wake up to a reality that many of us have been warning about for years. Let me be clear from the start. This isn't about the European Union scheming to destroy Russia. That's the kind of rhetoric that echoes from the Kremlin propaganda channels, inverting reality to cast the aggressor as the victim. This is something far more important. Whether the West has the courage to defend the principles that have underwritten peace and prosperity for nearly 8 decades. When we talk about European involvement in Ukraine, we need to understand what's actually at stake here. This isn't just about one country's sovereignty, though that alone would be worth defending. This is about whether the post-World War II consensus that borders cannot be changed by force, that might doesn't make right, that international law means something, will survive into the next generation. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 wasn't just an attack on Kiev. It was an attack on every principle the democratic world claims to hold dear. Vladimir Putin looked at the international order, calculated that the West had grown weak and divided, and made a bet that he could redraw the map of Europe through raw military force. He believed we'd wring our hands, impose some sanctions, and ultimately accept his territorial conquests as a fait accompli. For the first time in generations, Europe is being forced to reckon with the possibility that it might need to do more than just write checks and issue strongly worded statements. And that's terrifying to a continent that has grown comfortable letting America do the heavy lifting while criticizing American foreign policy from the comfort of American security guarantees. Here's what makes this moment so critical. Russia under Putin represents an explicitly revisionist power that rejects the entire framework of the liberal international order. This isn't about legitimate security concerns or NATO expansion. That's a red herring designed to justify territorial expansion. Russia signed the Budapest Memorandum, guaranteeing Ukraine's territorial integrity in exchange for Ukraine giving up nuclear weapons. Russia signed the 1997 Russia-NATO Founding Act that explicitly recognized each nation's right to choose its own security arrangements. Putin doesn't care about these agreements because he doesn't believe in a rules-based system where Russia is merely one player among many. He believes in spheres of influence, in great powers carving up regions, in the idea that strong nations have a natural right to dominate weaker neighbors. This is 19th century imperialism dressed up in 21st century propaganda. And let's not forget the China dimension here. Beijing is watching carefully how the West responds to Russian aggression. If Putin succeeds in taking Ukraine, or even in keeping the territory he's already seized, it sends a clear message to Xi Jinping about Taiwan. The authoritarian axis is testing us, probing for weakness, coordinating their challenges to democratic governance worldwide. When we see Russia and China deepening their no-limits partnership, conducting joint military exercises, supporting each other's territorial claims, and working together to undermine dollar dominance and Western institutions, we need to recognize this for what it is, a coordinated challenge to the democratic world order. These aren't isolated regional issues. They're connected fronts in a broader struggle between two fundamentally different visions of how the world should work. For too long, Europe has enjoyed what I'd call a strategic vacation from history, protected by American military might and enriched by global trade. European nations could afford to slash defense budgets, pursue Russia policy through rose-tinted economic engagement, and treat security as an afterthought. Germany's Wandel durch Handel, Change through trade looked like enlightened statesmanship right up until Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine, while German factories hummed along on cheap Russian gas. That era is over. Europe needs to face some uncomfortable truths. First, American security guarantees, while still robust, cannot be taken for granted indefinitely. American domestic politics are increasingly polarized, and isolationist sentiment exists across the political spectrum. Europe needs to be capable of defending itself and its values, with or without Washington's leadership. Second, energy dependence on authoritarian regimes is a strategic vulnerability, not just an economic relationship. Every pipeline from Russia, every rare earth mineral supply chain running through China, represents a pressure point that can be weaponized. Europe learned this the hard way when Putin turned off the gas taps. The lesson needs to stick. Third, there's no appeasing a revisionist power. Every concession, every off-ramp, every frozen conflict rewards aggression and invites the next incursion. The idea that we can buy peace by giving Putin a part of Ukraine is not just morally bankrupt, it's strategically illiterate. It would teach him that aggression works, guarantee another war in 5 years, and demonstrate to every authoritarian regime that the West will fold under pressure. Now, let's talk about what European troops in Ukraine might actually mean, because this is where the conversation gets serious. Let's cut through the diplomatic language and assess what actually matters. Can Europe defeat Russia in a direct military confrontation? The answer is yes, and it's not even particularly close when you look at the numbers objectively. The European Union's combined GDP is roughly 17 trillion, higher than China's. Russia's is around 2 trillion, smaller than Italy's. Modern warfare is fundamentally about industrial capacity and the ability to sustain operations. Russia is a gas station with nukes, not a peer competitor to a mobilized Europe. Population-wise, the EU has about 450 million people versus Russia's 144 million. The European major powers, France, Germany, Poland, Italy, Spain, represent over 250 million people with advanced economies and industrial bases. Combined EU defense spending is approximately 300 billion annually. Russia claims around 86 billion, though corruption means actual effective spending is probably 30 to 40% less. France alone spends 54 billion. Germany has committed to sustained spending above 70 billion. But raw spending doesn't tell you everything. What matters is what you get for that money. Europe produces advanced 4th and 5th generation fighter aircraft. The Eurofighter Typhoon, Rafale, and F-35s are a generation ahead of most Russian aircraft. Russia has maybe a dozen Su-57s that actually work. They're flying upgraded Soviet-era jets for the majority of the Air Force. Russia's thousands of tanks are mostly T-72s from the 1970s and T-80s from the 1980s, pulled from storage and barely functional. We've seen them in Ukraine. They're death traps. Modern European tanks like the Leopard 2A7, Leclerc, and Challenger 3 outclass Russian armor in fire control, armor protection, crew survivability, and range. Russia's T-14 Armada exists mostly in propaganda videos. They can't produce them at scale. And when it comes to naval power, it isn't even a contest. France operates nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. Italy has 2 carriers. The UK has 2 Queen Elizabeth-class carriers. Russia's Admiral Kuznetsov requires tugboats because it breaks down constantly. Russia's Black Sea Fleet has been humiliated by Ukraine, a nation without a navy, losing multiple major vessels to missiles and maritime drones. Ukraine has provided an unprecedented real-world test of Russian military capacity. This is a nation with a GDP smaller than Portugal, using Soviet-era equipment and Western hand-me-downs, fighting Russia to a standstill and pushing them back. Ukrainian forces have destroyed thousands of Russian tanks and armored vehicles, shot down hundreds of aircraft, sunk or damaged much of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, and killed or wounded several 100,000 Russian soldiers. They've done this while fighting with restrictions, preventing strikes deep into Russian territory. Now imagine, instead of Ukraine with limited Western equipment, you have French, German, and Polish forces with full NATO integration, unlimited ammunition, complete air superiority, satellite reconnaissance, cyber warfare capabilities, and no restrictions on targeting. The result wouldn't be a grinding war of attrition, it would be a systematic dismantling of Russian forces. Russia has struggled to maintain supply lines in Ukraine, literally next door to their border. They've resorted to Iranian drones, North Korean artillery shells, and Chinese components because their military-industrial complex can't produce weapons at necessary scale. Europe has the industrial capacity to ramp up production dramatically. Germany alone can produce tanks, artillery, and munitions at scales Russia can't match. France has a complete military-industrial complex producing everything from submarines to satellites. Rail and road infrastructure in Europe is vastly superior to Russia's. Russia couldn't even maintain logistics in the Kiev offensive. They ran out of fuel and food within days. In any conventional conflict, air superiority determines everything else. European air forces collectively operate over 500 advanced 4th-generation fighters and are incorporating 5th-generation F-35s. They have modern AWACS aircraft, tanker support, electronic warfare capabilities, and integrated air defense systems. Russia has maybe 150 modern fighters that are actually operational. Their pilot training is inferior. Ukrainian pilots with limited training have consistently outperformed Russian aviators. Russian maintenance is poor. Ukraine has shot down several of their few operational A-50 early warning aircraft. With air superiority established, which would happen within the first week, Russian ground forces become targets. Supply convoys, command posts, artillery positions, and troop concentrations would be destroyed systematically. We've seen this playbook in Desert Storm. It works. Poland is one wild card. Poland has quietly become one of the most formidable land powers in Europe. They're acquiring 1,000 K2 tanks from South Korea, 250 Abrams tanks from the United States, 48 F-35 fighters, 32 F-16s, and hundreds of HIMARS launchers. Their active duty military is 200,000 strong and expanding. They're spending over 4% of GDP on defense, more than anyone else in NATO. Polish forces are positioned geographically to cut off any Russian advance westward. If Poland enters a conflict against Russia, they bring capability and motivation that would be devastating to Russian forces. Russia has nuclear weapons, but so does France, so does the UK. Mutually assured destruction means nuclear powers deter nuclear use. They don't provide immunity for conventional aggression. Putin has made nuclear threats repeatedly throughout the Ukraine conflict. He threatened over weapons shipments, those weapons were shipped, over HIMARS, delivered, over tanks, they arrived, over F-16s, and they're flying. Each red line was crossed and the promised nuclear response never came. Why? Because using nuclear weapons would guarantee Russia's destruction and turn them into a global pariah forever. China would abandon them. Even Russian allies would distance themselves. The economic isolation would be total. Nuclear weapons are a deterrent, not a blank check. Russia knows this. The bluff has been called repeatedly. If France and Germany committed forces to Ukraine, the operational picture would change overnight. First, air superiority would be established within days. European air forces would suppress Russian air defenses, destroy their airfields, and dominate Ukrainian airspace. Second, long-range precision strikes would target Russian logistics, command and control, and ammunition depots hundreds of kilometers behind the front line. These are standard NATO operational concepts. Third, armored and mechanized forces would conduct combined arms operations that Russian forces have proven incapable of defending against. Ukrainian forces with limited training have pulled off successful combined arms operations. Professional European forces would execute these at a level Russia can't match. Fourth, cyber and electronic warfare would degrade Russian communications, navigation, and command systems. Europe has sophisticated offensive cyber capabilities that have been restrained by policy and not capability. The timeline wouldn't be years. Organized Russian resistance would likely collapse within months, possibly weeks. Once Russian forces faced peer opponents with unlimited supplies and no political constraints, it would be over. China could benefit from a weak, dependent Russia. Why would they sacrifice their economic relationship with Europe, 10 times larger than their trade with Russia, to save Putin's war? The answer is that they wouldn't. China would issue statements about peaceful resolution, abstain at the UN, and continue trading with whoever's winning. They're not going to war with Europe over Ukraine. The economic suicide alone makes it impossible. China's military is optimized for a Pacific conflict over Taiwan, not land warfare in Eastern Europe. Their logistics to support operations thousands of kilometers from their border don't exist. European political leadership hasn't made the case to their populations for why victory matters and what resources it requires. Germany's Zeitenwald was a start, but implementation has been slow. Defense procurement is bureaucratic. Political debates over operational restrictions continue. France has the capability, but has been inconsistent. Macron talks tough, but then backs down. There's no sustained political consensus. But the capability exists. The industrial base exists. The technological edge exists. The numerical superiority exists. What's missing is the political decision to mobilize these advantages decisively. Here's the bottom line. Can Europe defeat Russia militarily? Absolutely. The combined military power of France, Germany, Poland, and supporting European nations outclasses Russia in virtually every metric: economy, technology, industrial production, population, training, and equipment quality. The war in Ukraine has exposed Russian military weakness comprehensively. They can't achieve air superiority over a nation without a modern air force. They can't conduct combined arms operations effectively. Their logistics are in shambles. Their equipment is obsolete. A mobilized Europe wouldn't face a near-peer competitor. They'd face a regional power with nukes, throwing conscripts at the problem and hoping Western resolve breaks before their manpower does. The question was never, can Europe win? The question is, will European leaders commit to winning? The military capability to dismantle Russian forces decisively already exists. It's sitting in European bases, waiting for political leadership to deploy it. Russia survives on the calculation that Europe lacks the will to fight. Prove that calculation wrong, and the war ends on European terms. The military math isn't complicated, it's the politics that is hard.